All right, so good morning, everybody, and welcome to Teach to Reach 2018. It's a real privilege to be here again, and it's great to see you all really well. For those who don't know me already, my name is Pienkowski. I'm one of the founders and partners of the organization known as Old City Learning. I'm known in some circles as a teaching and learning guy, and I've been involved in creating learning solutions of some shape or another for well over the last 20 years. I also happen to be an entrepreneur. I've started a number of organizations, or helped start a number of organizations over the years. And one of the beliefs that I've come to develop during my professional time, and particularly as an entrepreneur, is that an idea by itself isn't worth a thing. I could come up, right now, I could come up with 100 ideas, or maybe even more. But we'd all be lucky if maybe one or two of them were really worth anything. In the end, an idea that hasn't withstood the test of reality or been put to productive use is really nothing more than an untested hypothesis. Now, over the last couple of years, those of us who have been attending Teach to Reach have been exposed to a number of very interesting and inspiring ideas. And I can say with 100% confidence that every single one of those ideas have been put to the test of some people's realities and have been put to productive use by some people in some cases. But I'm also quite confident that for many of us, many of those ideas remain untested. They're untested hypotheses because they have not withstood the test of our realities. We haven't put them to productive use in as many cases as we could. So this is the week that that's all going to change. We're going to continue our work together as a group and as groups to take these ideas that we've learned and to create plans for turning them into tangible results. So we're going to begin, or for many of us, continue our journey from knowing to doing.
By talking about a study that was conducted a number of years ago by a number of neuroscientists. They were studying people who had experienced physiological trauma to the parts of their brains that allow them to form new memories. So these are folks who couldn't form new memories. They could remember the experiences that they'd had before the trauma, but they couldn't remember anything afterwards. In fact, for many of these people, they couldn't remember things that they had done just 5 minutes prior. So from the outside, it may seem as though these folks could lead relatively normal functioning lives, but the reality is that they would have to use all kinds of tools and tactics just to get through a day. Like they'd have to take sticky notes and put them all over the room just to remind them why they maybe even walked into that room and to finish the things that they had started. So what the researchers did is they took these folks and they divided them into two groups. They had one group sit down and read a manual on how to perform a single, simple task on a forklift. They made sure they understood it, then they sent them all home. And then with the next group, they had them do the same thing. They read the manual, but unlike the first group, each one had the opportunity to sit on the forklift while an expert showed them how to actually perform the procedure until they could do it independently without any assistance. They were sent home, and then everybody was brought back again. And as you would expect, none of them had any recollection of ever having been there. They didn't recall looking at the manual or being taught how to use the forklift. And unsurprisingly, when they took the group that had just read the manual and they asked them to get on the forklift and perform a task, they simply couldn't do it. Surprisingly, however, some members of the group that had been taught how to actually use the forklift could in fact do it. They had no recollection of ever being taught how to perform this task on the forklift, but they could actually do it. Now, of course, I'm simplifying the study a little bit and the results, but ultimately, what this tells us and what these neuroscientists were actually able to confirm using neuroimaging is that the part of the brain that we use to process and consume information is different than the part of the brain that we use to learn and remember and repeat tasks. So this study, for me, highlights something that I and sometimes others refer to as the knowing-doing gap, which is this wide chasm that exists between our knowing about something and our putting that knowing into meaningful action. So this is a well-known phenomena that we've all experienced at some point, and we're all going to continue to experience, and it's been studied for well over 100 years in a lot of creative ways. And the knowing-doing gap is a relatively simple idea to understand, and I'm guessing that many of you have thought about it or grappled with it at some point along the way. But as simple as it is, it actually has a lot of very significant implications. In immunization alone, we spend millions of dollars and many, many hours every year developing the capabilities of our workforces. And yet when we look at how people are trained and developed, there's absolutely no question that we're leaving many, many people stranded on the knowing side of this knowing-doing gap. And what that means is we're leaving a lot of hardworking, committed, earnest people with the burden of figuring out how to take their knowledge and translate that into meaningful, productive action. But the thing is that shouldn't be their burden. That's our burden. As capacity builders and as trainers, as leaders and as supervisors, it's our job to help them forge that bridge from knowing to doing. But when we don't do that, what ends up happening is many of our attempts to integrate new knowledge and skills into the workforce don't yield any results. The knowledge and skill remains untapped, nothing more than potential, like an untested hypothesis. So if we can find a bridge across this gap, if we can help people to take their knowing and translate that into meaningful, goal-directed action, the results can be quite profound. If you really think about it, the ability to teach and the ability to learn are fundamental to so many things that we do in life. I would argue that they're fundamental to being a good parent. They're fundamental to being a good manager and a good supervisor. They're certainly fundamental to rolling out agricultural techniques, to introducing a new vaccine into a health system, to modifying a supply chain or optimizing a data management system. If you really think about it, teaching or learning are a critical component of so many of the things that we try to achieve both in work and in life. So if we can make even a modest improvement in the way that we do that, when you compound those improvements across an entire ecosystem, the results can be quite profound. Now, at this point, some of you may be thinking, well, that's a really nice idea, Nathan, but like you said before, it's just an idea. And, maybe that's true, but I can guarantee you that I'm not the only one with this idea. In 2016, in the US alone, $161 billion were spent on professional education. This doesn't include any money that was spent on universities or the college system. It doesn't include any money spent in primary education. This is purely the amount of money that was spent educating adults who are already in the workforce. When you look across the globe, that number more than doubles. So to put this into perspective, in the US, we spend a little bit more on fast food. Not a lot, but a little bit more. But in the US alone, we spend more on adult education than the whole world spends on movies, music, and then we spend on laptops, for example, in the US. So what this tells me is that as a society, we value continuing to develop our professional skills about as much as we value being able to get food quickly and easily, and a lot more than music and movies and laptops and a whole lot of other things. So clearly there's a lot of time and energy that's being spent on continued education, and really this should come as no surprise, because when we all look around us, the rate of change in our world just keeps on accelerating. And the pace of change keeps accelerating. We keep seeing new products, new technologies, new processes, new guidelines, new guidance documents. There's just new all around us. So it is a bit of a generalization and maybe even a cliche, but there is some truth to the statement that the winner goes to those who can learn the best and the fastest. So how do we as a community get there? How do we turn that into reality? Well, I'm not going to say that it's going to be easy, but what I can say is that the building blocks for this are all around us. Just taking Teach to Reach as an example, we've been presented with a wide array of different ideas, very useful ideas about how people learn, how to teach, how to provide learning opportunities on the job, and so on and so forth. Even still, though, I think that a lot of us would agree that many of these ideas, it may not always be clear when to use one idea, when to use another, when to not use some of these ideas, how to take some of these ideas and use them together to create an integrated strategy that will help us get the behavior gains that we're looking for. So in other words, many of these ideas still remain disconnected and ultimately divorced from application. So what will help and what we really need is some kind of a model or a framework or something that will help us take these building blocks and put them together to form a foundation on which we can stand as we engage in this continuous process of optimizing and developing our workforce. And that's a model that I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. Now, the model that I'm going to present here is founded on a couple of very important concepts, the first of which is that the goal of any workforce development initiative is to produce meaningful, productive workforce behaviors. The goal is not to create training, and it's not even to create learning. Training and learning ultimately are of no use to us if they don't result in meaningful behavior, the behaviors that we're looking for. Training and learning might be requirements to get the behaviors we're looking for. Maybe, maybe not. But ultimately, they're a means to an end, not ends in and of themselves. Now, for many of you, this may seem like an obvious statement. But in my experience, most of the training and capacity building failures that I've seen can be traced back to a root cause of a failure to think in this way and a failure to maintain the understanding that our goal is to produce meaningful workforce behavior changes. Now, when we fail to keep in mind that our goal is to produce meaningful behaviors, it has a number of negative consequences. One of which is that it has a negative impact on the way that we teach. And another is that it closes our minds to many of the tools and techniques and methods and things that are essentially available for us to help in developing, supporting, and incentivizing the behaviors that we're looking for. And to just dig into the effect that it can have on our teaching practices, when we think about learning and training as the act of taking stuff, knowledge and information, and putting it in people's heads, well, what that leads to is an information-centric approach to teaching. So what happens is we spend all of our time and attention focusing on the stuff that we're trying to put in people's heads. And the more stuff, the better, right? I mean, after all, if the idea is we're taking information and ideas and things and putting it in people's heads, well, the more, the better. And we focus all of our attention on the information and the things and the lesson plans and the PowerPoints and all these different things, right? So in academic circles, this stuff that I keep referring to is referred to as a stimulus or stimuli. And the reason that it's called that is because, at least in theory, the purpose of it is to provoke a response, a behavior, right? So the thing is, when all we're doing is thinking about the stimulus, we're analyzing it and we're taking apart all the information and reorganizing it and designing it and making it look good and everything. And we're kind of ignoring the response. But the response is the behavior. So if the purpose of the stimulus is to produce a particular response, but we're not giving the response adequate attention, what are the chances that we're actually going to produce a stimulus that gives us the response we're looking for? It's slim to none. Whereas if we focus on the response and we're focused on the behavior, then what happens is instead of analyzing information and thinking about information, we analyze behaviors. We try to understand the behaviors. We try to understand the things that are influencing those behaviors. We try to manipulate the things that are influencing those behaviors so that we'll get the outcome that we're looking for. So it completely changes your orientation. So this stimulus-response interaction is ultimately can be a useful way of thinking about it, because in essence, it actually mimics the way that we actually learn in the real world, even just like right out of the womb. We do something to the environment responds with some feedback. If that's not the feedback that we wanted, we do something else, and we keep doing that until we get the response that we want. Once we get the response that we want, we make a mental note. Oh, okay, so if I want this outcome, then I need to perform these actions. So the stimulus response is a simplified model of how we naturally learn. And when people talk about training being interactive, what they're ultimately saying is interactive training is one that has a large number of stimulus response couplings. And one that isn't interactive is one that's largely stimulus based. So to summarize this, when we're focused on the stuff that we're training, we end up with information-centered processes and activities and instruction. And when we focus on the response, we end up with activity and action and behavioral-focused instruction and interventions as well. Now, I realize that I've gotten a bit theoretical here with this thing that it looks like a mathematical, like we've translated it into some engineering schematic, and this is about as far as I'm going to go with this. And I also, before I move on, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of the things that I'm talking about in academic circles are subject to, in some cases, a lot of heated debate. But as a practitioner, I'm not particularly concerned with that, because with over 20 years of experience, I truly believe that thinking in this way, thinking about what we're doing as behaviors and cultivating behaviors, is the single most important tool that we have at our disposal. And if all we do is change our thinking to think about behaviors, it will have impacts on the downstream decisions and activities that we get involved in. So if we were only going to do one thing, it would be to focus on behaviors and to make sure that we fully understand the behaviors that we're trying to influence before we think about how to actually train and cultivate and develop and sustain the behaviors that we're looking for. Now, I just said that understanding the behaviors that you're trying to influence is a critical part of any sort of workforce development initiative. And actually doing that can be pretty straightforward, but in a lot of cases, as those of us in the practitioner community know, a lot of times it's not quite as straightforward as it seems, because oftentimes there are operational problems that masquerade as behavior problems, and there will be behavior problems that masquerade as operations problems. And to illustrate that point, I want to tell a story. This is a story that I heard early in my days in training. I really don't know whether this is true, and I don't particularly care, because it is a good story to illustrate the point. So one day, the CEO of a major American airline had had a long day of work, and he was traveling home on his own airline, and he decided to unwind to order a glass of red wine. So the red wine came to him, but he noticed that it was in a white wine glass. And for him, this was troubling. As a cultured, educated man, he understood that this isn't the way that red wine is supposed to be served. And he thought that it reflected poorly on the airline. And it was a sign that perhaps they weren't paying as close attention to service quality as they should be. So when he got back to the office, he made sure that everyone, all of the flight attendants, thousands and thousands of people, were going to be trained on how to properly serve wine. So they put this into motion, and it cost millions of dollars, took 12 months, but they got it done. So shortly after that, he was again flying on his own airline, and he ordered red wine, and it was again served to him in a white wine glass. You can imagine how appalled he must have been. So he stood up, went to the service galley, and found the flight attendant who had served him and politely asked, "Why did you serve me white wine or red wine in a white wine glass?" And she said, "Well, sir, these are the only glasses that we stock on these airplanes." So you can see how, in this particular case, real or not, that the CEO could have saved himself and the entire organization a whole lot of time if they had simply taken the time to understand the behaviors that are involved, how they're related to the environment and the overall performance environment, they would have saved a lot of time and probably solved that problem a lot more quickly and a lot less expensively. So I want to use one more example for this, and you don't have to worry too much about reading this. I know there's a lot of text there. I'll go over this for you, but this comes at the problem from maybe a little bit of a different angle. So this is Julie, and this is fictional, although I can tell you that it is based on reality, my own reality. So this is Julie. She is a sales representative for a fictional pharmaceutical company. So one day Julie gets a call from her supervisor, and he says to her, "Hey Julie, headquarters keeps nagging me to get you to take this compliance training. Can you just go take the training so they'll stop nagging me?" So Julie agrees because her boss asked her to, of course. So she goes to training, and among other things, in training, they tell her this: the product that you are selling, the government has only approved for the use in treating blepharospasm. You are only allowed to speak with doctors about its use in treating blepharospasm. Even if there's research suggesting that it's effective for other things, you are only allowed to talk about this in relation to its treating of blepharospasm. Clear enough. So Julie completes training, goes back out into the workforce, and shortly thereafter, she starts to get a bit stressed because her sales numbers are lower than her peers. She's got a performance review coming up. Her pay is going to be based on how well her numbers are looking. And through conversations with her colleagues, she's learned that there's a new article out in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very respected peer-reviewed journal, suggesting that their product is really effective in treating pain as well. And she knows that many of her peers are taking that article and distributing it to the doctors in their area. Julie's got this review coming up in a few weeks, and the only thing she's going to discuss with her supervisor in that review are her sales numbers. All right, so show of hands, who thinks that Julie is going to distribute this journal article to her physician? Tell me, there are probably a number of reasons. So who wants to tell me a reason why they think that Julie is going to violate what she was taught in training? Yes?
Realism, because having realized that her peers are doing it, and she's going for a review to also determine her promo, she has to also do like her peers.
That's right. So you just mentioned a few things. It's her peers. If her peers are doing it and they're not seeing any consequences, why wouldn't she? Her pay is based on it. She's going to get more money if she violates what they told her to do in training than if she doesn't. Has she seen any consequences? Are there any? Who else? Who's got some other thoughts about why she might not? One thing that I notice in this is when the supervisor asks her, his reason for wanting her to do it is just to get headquarters off his back. So that's sending the message to Julie that he doesn't particularly seem to care at least, very much about the training itself. He just wants her to go to training so he can check off the box. So in this circumstance, there are a whole lot of factors that are confounding the chances that she's going to act the way she's supposed to act. She's probably got the skill and the knowledge needed to act in the right way. I mean, I don't really see how you could be any more clear about it. It's clear. She's not supposed to do it. But there are all kinds of factors that are really going to influence that behavior. Now, I had another case study here, but I'm going to skip through this. So the point here is that whenever all of us, and any human being, is choosing to behave in a particular way, there are a whole lot of things that are going to influence that decision. You know, I might be tired. It might be really hard. It might be easier to do something else. There are all kinds of things that are going to influence that decision. And I have a few of them listed here, but the thing that I want to point out is that of the things that I have listed, notice that skills and knowledge are really only one of them. So what that means, the implication of that, is that this person could have all the skill and knowledge that they need to behave in the way that we're looking for and still not behave in that way. And it also means that if we're trainers, we could do the best possible job there is training people. We could do a perfect job and not see the behaviors that we're looking for in the workplace. So if we're really going to help to cultivate and see the behaviors that we want to see in the workplace, we need a more multifaceted, multifactorial approach that takes a number of things into consideration. The brain, so these are the skills and the knowledge and the attitudes that exist inside the head. The skills and the knowledge, these are, of course, important, so we need to take that into consideration. And that's the easy part, and when I say that, I don't mean it's easy to accomplish that, but it's the part that we all tend to think about, and we acknowledge that. Then there's the body, what I'm referring to as the body, and by this I mean the physical environment. So what things in the physical environment might influence the behaviors that we're looking for? Are there things we can do to endow that environment with supportive things that encourage or even produce learning? How are we going to produce learning? How are they going to receive learning? This is the physical environment. And then the third piece is something that I'm referring to as the backdrop, and the reason I'm calling that is because it starts with a B. Brain, body, backdrop. So there's a nice little alliteration there, but it refers to the social and political environment in which the behaviors are to take place. So the supervisory systems, the influence of peers, the influence of existing incentives and things of this nature, all of these will influence behavior. So a multifaceted approach to behavioral development and workforce development is going to accommodate and consider all of these different factors. So in doing this, this is something that I'm calling whole person learning, okay? Now before I get into this, I just want to say that if you Google whole person learning, I don't think you're going to find anything, or maybe I have appropriated somebody else's phrase, but I don't think you're going to find anything. I just came up with this, and I also want to say that I don't consider this a product of me, of my mind or my invention. I consider this a product of Teach to Reach. And the reason that I consider it a product of Teach to Reach is because this came about through considering all of the things that have been presented to us in Teach to Reach. For those of you who have been to others, you've seen that I've gotten into the habit of presenting a summary of the prior year's Teach to Reaches and the summaries of the summaries and everything. And in going through all of these things and all of these interesting ideas, plus throwing a little bit of my experience in there, these were just the natural categories that things seem to fall into. So this whole person learning idea is really owned by and created by and originated in Teach to Reach. So, has anybody here ever heard of the business model canvas? We got someone over here. So, all right, so the business model canvas is a one-page template that has come into very common use in Silicon Valley and amongst the startup communities in the United States. And it's essentially a structure or a guideline document that is there to help people who are trying to think through new products to bring to the market or new businesses to start. And ultimately, it helps people think through all the different things that should be thought through so they don't forget anything, et cetera, and so forth. And it all comes in a nice, neat sort of package, a one-page template here. So this is used at the Stanford Design School, which is considered many the home of innovation. And when you look at it, it seems pretty simple, and each of these cells you can fill out. But by looking at this, you shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that you can just sit down, fill it out, and then you're done. Each one of these cells may have work behind them in order to fill them out. Well, ever since the business model canvas came into a lot of practice or a lot of use, we're starting to see a lot of canvases as a concept and as a tool. So we'll see like the empathy canvas and the culture map and things like that. So in the spirit of the popularity of canvases and the utility, the utter usefulness of those, I've created the whole person learning canvas. And you can see that I don't think there's really anything in there that at this point should be surprising, because it ultimately is simply an expression of the things that I've gone over thus far. The one thing that I will point out about it is that all of the things, every talk that we've been given at Teach to Reach so far fits into one of these boxes. So adaptive learning, instructional design 101, principles of learning, and things like that fit into the brain category. E-learning, mobile learning, job aids, the 5 moments of learning need, these fit into the body category. And in the backdrop, we've got learning culture, change management, and things like that. So one of the ideas behind this is that it can help to give us some guidance on when and how we might use some of those ideas that we've been presented with. Now, just a brief overview, a brief walkthrough of the canvas. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you'll note that we have system, outcome, and behavior, and then the brain, body, and backdrop. A word about the system, outcome, and behavior. The idea here is that behaviors in and of themselves, we're not just trying to produce a bunch of behaviors. Well, maybe sometimes we are, but in a lot of cases, there's some sort of system outcome, some kind of result, improvement in the performance of the system that we're trying to achieve in cultivating a particular set of behaviors. And if that's true, then it's important that we express that, and that there is some relationship between the behaviors that we're targeting and the system outcome evaluation. But if there is no relationship there, then ultimately, when you get into an evaluation, it's not going to be fair to judge your behavioral change system according to system outcomes. So if you don't have a link between these two, then ultimately, when you go and measure your results, the only fair thing to do is to measure behavior. But anyway, that's jumping ahead here. We've got the brain components and the body components in the backdrop. So the skills, the knowledge, the attitude, the body or the physical environment, how is training going to be delivered, what other sorts of learning and performance support assets may be produced, and the backdrop. How are we going to leverage the supervisory environment? How are we going to make sure that peers don't undermine and actually support our initiatives, and so on and so forth? And as I said before, each one of these cells has a bit more to it than meets the eye. And so in this particular case, there are little sub-canvases for each one of the different items. So just as an example, with behavior, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to express a behavior without doing it in reference to the audience. How are we going to know whether people are exhibiting this behavior? How are we going to know when they're not? With the brain, we've got motivation and skills. But I want to step through this and just explain how the canvas can be used in a variety of different contexts. You can use it for analyzing your needs. So in other words, it can be a template for describing your current state. How are things right now? What am I dealing with? So for example, what do people already know how to do? What do they not know how to do? Etc. How do they learn now? Are there opportunities for them to learn that are being missed? How are they currently supervised? How are they currently incentivized? How do they interact with peers? What role do peers play in the behaviors that they exhibit? For documenting your strategy, this is the part we've been talking about. How are we going to teach them? What are we going to teach them? When are they going to be taught? Where are they going to be taught? What are we going to do to enable their work environment to support them? And how might we leverage the supervisory systems? And you can also use it for evaluation and looking back and saying, okay, well, let's take a look. Did we teach them the right things? Did we teach them in the right way? Did their environment support and enable them or actually undermine their efforts? Etc. Now, I'm going to close here that when I was learning to be an instructional designer, and I think most instructional designers will be able to rise with this, I was taught that when you're creating instruction in the early stages, you need to create behavioral objectives or learning objectives. And they're usually taught, you're right, it's a very formal, strict, kind of awkward-looking way. And when I was first creating these, it felt awkward and it felt strange. And I often have to admit, I often would say, why do I have to do this? I don't really get why I have to do this. But with it, can you designing instruction, And over time, I really learned that what was happening is, it's not that these behavioral objectives that I was writing have utility in the training that I would produce per se, but what they were doing is they were conditioning me to think in a particular way. And once I got over the awkwardness and it became easy to create them, I began to actually think differently, which is the same thing as saying that I began to perceive the world differently. So creating behavioral objectives endowed me with a new cognitive skill, a new way of perceiving the world that has been utterly helpful for me in my career. So in a similar vein, filling out the whole person learning canvas, there may be parts that seem maybe awkward or difficult, or like you're sort of trying to conform to something that doesn't quite seem natural. And that may be the case. But I'm quite sure that if you stick with it and you do it, that over time, it will condition you to think in a particular way. And you won't need the canvas anymore. You'll simply be endowed with a new way of thinking, which again is the same way of saying you'll be endowed with a new way of perceiving the world. And that will be a tool that you'll be able to use in many different ways throughout your work life and maybe even your personal life as well. So that's all I have. Thank you for your time and attention.